It's time for lecture number 11. Today the focus will be on World War II, Part 1. The focus of the presentation today is to explore World War II in Europe. First, we'll address the steps taken by Germany in the 1930s as they were very aggressive and they eventually culminated in the war. Then we'll look at the course of the war in Europe and the initial successes of German troops on the field of battle. Then we'll explore the alliances between the Allied powers and how they worked together to try to defeat Germany. And then we'll explore how Germany was eventually defeated. We'll begin by addressing some of the steps taken by Germany that eventually resulted in the war. Remember this slide from a previous topic? What we'll see is that Hitler's book Mein Kampf was almost a blueprint for his actions during the 1930s once he came to power. Hitler's first step dealt with the Rhineland. It's shown here on the right. As a result of the Versailles Treaty, this remained part of Germany's territory. However, they were not allowed to have any troops in that region. Here's another view of the Rhineland. It was part of Germany's territory, but it was along their border with the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Hitler wanted to test the waters and see how the different European nations would react if he violated this provision of the Versailles Treaty. Well, in March of 1936, German troops occupied the Rhineland. Basically, no one did anything to stop Germany. The French protested, but that was really it. The next steps dealt with Austria and the Sudetenland. The circled area on this map identifies Austria. If you remember, Hitler was actually born in Austria. He wanted to unify Germany and Austria once again. They had been in the past at different times, but Hitler wanted to make it permanent. Historically, there had been close relations between people living in Germany and Austria over the years. In fact, Hitler was even born in Austria. Because of these historical links, Hitler called for Nazis to be included in the Austrian cabinet. When leaders balked, German troops occupied and invaded Austria. The people were asked, do you support this union or Anschluss between Germany and Austria? Well, they didn't have much of a choice. They voted in a plebiscite overwhelmingly to approve this unification between Austria and Germany. Germany just took over the other country. The next step also took place in 1938, and this dealt with the Sudetenland, which was part of Czechoslovakia. You see the area of this map that's in dark brown where the arrows are pointing? This shows the Sudetenland, kind of along the border between Czechoslovakia and Germany. In 1938, Hitler argued that this region of the Sudetenland should become part of Germany. He argued in favor of this because it had a large German-speaking population, and some of the people who lived there wanted to be part of Germany. However, the government in Czechoslovakia refused. The mood in Europe was one that just did not want to have war. In fact, at the College of Oxford, a debate was held, and as a result of it, several men at this great institute of higher education took an oath, and they declared that under no circumstances would they fight for their king or country, even if their country was attacked. Everyone wanted peace because there had been so much bloodshed as a result of the First World War. In order to avoid war, a conference was held, and it was chaired by Neville Chamberlain, the leader of Great Britain. An agreement was reached. First of all, Germany received the Sudetenland. Secondly, in return, Hitler made a promise, or a pledge, that he would not seek any additional territory. As a result of this, one of the things that Hitler was convinced of was that, heck, he could do anything he wanted. No one was going to stand up to him. At the same time, the French and the British were determined that if Hitler made any more demands, they would be ready to fight. They were drawing a line in the sand. Well, Hitler made additional demands dealing with Poland. Within months of that Munich Conference, Hitler violated his pledge and demanded Poland's port city of Danzig should be returned to Germany. The arrow here is pointing to the city of Danzig. It initially had been part of Germany, but as a result of Germany's loss in the First World War, it had been stripped from them and given to Poland. The government in Poland refused. Hitler was ready to go to war, but he was concerned about the Soviet Union, so he took a controversial step. If Hitler invaded Poland and took that city of Danzig, well, this would pose a threat to the Soviet Union. So the thing that Hitler was worried about was angering the Soviets. So this eventually resulted in an agreement which came to be known as the Nazi-Soviet Pact. First, Germany and the Soviet Union agreed that they would not attack one another for a minimum of 10 years. Second, there was also a secret provision. They agreed that they would divide Poland between their two countries. Again, here we are with that map. The circled area here shows the region of Western Poland, and Germany agreed that they would have that territory. In the darker blue, where the arrows are pointing, that bordered the Soviet Union, the Soviets agreed to have the eastern portion of Poland. Once this peace agreement between the Germans and Soviets was in place, Hitler knew that he could act. And so, within a week of its signing, Germany invaded Poland, and this began the Second World War. Now, before I get into the specifics of the war, I did want to talk about an event called the Katyn Forest Massacre. After Germany invaded Poland, the Soviets followed. What they did was they went into different cities in Poland, and they took about 25,000 members of Poland's intelligentsia, members of the military, professors, teachers, things like that, and they murdered them. Why'd they do this? Well, in the years after the war, the Soviets planned to take over that territory and keep it. When I was in New Jersey recently, I saw a monument to the Katyn Forest Massacre. It was actually pretty surprising to me that this monument would be in New Jersey, but there was a large Polish population there. Next, I'd like to explore some of the early events in the war from 1939 to 42, where we see very successful German conquest. World War II began in September of 1939 when German troops invaded Poland. Germany employed several new technologies which helped with their success. Their strategy was called Blitzkrieg, which could be translated to lightning warfare. What they did was they began to target railroads and communication depots and things like that, and they bombed those, and then those air attacks were followed up with rapid troop movements where they were in jeeps and tanks and things like that. In a relatively short period of time, about a month, Poland fell to German forces. When Germany invaded Poland, a series of alliances were formed. The Allied powers at that time involved the British and the French, and the Germans formed the Axis powers. They were the leading country, but they also included Italy and Japan. Poland fell in the fall of 1939. The next spring, German forces invaded France. Within 6 weeks, this German Blitzkrieg had been successful, and France fell to the Germans. During World War I, the French had stood strong, but they had been bled dry by the war, and here we see victorious German soldiers right next to the Arc de Triomphe marching in the streets of Paris. Next came the Battle of Britain. After the fall of France, the British stood alone. Hitler's plan was to invade Great Britain. In order to facilitate this, several cities were bombed beginning in June of 1940, and this was a massive bombing campaign, and many civilians became victims. British used the radar and radio to try to help determine when these bombing raids would happen, but also the radio was used to influence morale. Eventually, the British also were able to crack the German code with something called Ultra. While Hitler tried to invade, or he was going to invade, the British Isles, he eventually abandoned this plan and turned his efforts elsewhere. After it became clear that this British invasion was not going to work, he turned his efforts to the east, toward Russia. In June of 1941, in complete violation of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, German forces invaded the Soviet Union. This German Blitzkrieg, once again, was very successful. Stalin was in denial for some time and did not establish defenses along his eastern border with Germany. German forces invaded, and you can see the extent of their invasion by 1942 with the arrows on this map. The alliances began to change. The Soviet Union eventually joined the Allied powers. We'll next explore how the United States became involved in the war. Just as in World War I, when fighting broke out in Europe, the United States maintained its neutrality. However, the Americans continued to favor the Allied powers. Eventually, they were drawn into the war due to events in Hawaii. Just as the Germans had acted aggressively in Europe in the 1930s, the Japanese were doing the same thing in the Pacific. The circled area shows the Japanese mainland. The other arrows are pointing to parts of China, as well as the French colony of Indochina, where the Japanese were expanding their territory. The Japanese had undertaken these aggressive tactics, the United States established an embargo against them, and then the Japanese decided to strike against the Americans. After having maintained radio silence for some time, on Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese surprised the Americans by attacking its naval base in Hawaii. This was an incredibly successful attack. 19 ships were sunk. About 2,000 people died. Here we see the USS Arizona. When it was destroyed, about 1,100 people died. The day after the attack at Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war. Congress agreed, and the United States joined the Allied powers, and the alliance system was complete. Next, I'd like to look at the steps that led toward the defeat of Germany. The first will begin with diplomacy and the Big Three. The first member of the Big Three is shown here, Winston Churchill. He was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He had a goal for victory during the Second World War. He continually argued about attacking Germany through the soft underbelly of Europe. What he meant by that was going through Italy first. Because German forces were so strong, Churchill argued that they should initially engage the Axis powers in North Africa and then go up the weak part of the Axis powers, Italy, and then they could strike at the heart of Germany, as these arrows show. The second individual included in the Big Three is shown here. This is Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. His goal for victory was the creation of a second front in Western Europe. There was a great deal of deadly fighting on the Eastern Front on the border between Germany and Russia. And you see that with the arrow there on the right. What Stalin wanted was he wanted the creation of a second front in Western Europe, someplace in France, in order to take the pressure off of his own country. Roosevelt promised a second front sometime in 1942, maybe even 43. Unfortunately, it did not come until 1944. In the meantime, between 20 and 30 million Soviets died. Stalin would not forget this. The Russian people bore the brunt of Germany's advances during the Second World War, and their sacrifices are recorded in a museum outside of Moscow. similar to America's Arlington National Cemetery. It was a powerful experience to visit that museum. The last member of the Big Three is shown here, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was the President of the United States. His goal was to defeat Germany first. Even though the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had brought the U.S. into the war, Germany was seen as a greater threat to the United States, so he wanted to defeat the Germans first with the fewest number of American casualties. We see a couple of images that show several members of the Big Three here. On the left, we see Roosevelt and Churchill in North Africa in January of 1943 at the Casablanca Conference. On the right, we see the very first time that the Big Three actually met all together. This was in Tehran in December of 1943. After years of Germany's advances, the tide began to turn in 1942. The Battle of Stalingrad took place in the winter of 1942 and 1943. This was a turning point in the war in Europe. After several years of Germany's advances, the Soviets stood strong, and they forced the Germans to retreat. It's circled here on the map. The image here depicts the devastation during the Battle of Stalingrad from that museum that I had mentioned. The fighting was incredibly bloody. Between August of 1942 and January of 1943, more Russians died at these series of battles than all of the American losses during the entire war. The tide began to turn in Italy as well. Churchill's policy to attack Italy first was adopted, and in 1943, the Axis powers were defeated in North Africa, and then they went up the Italian peninsula, and Mussolini was kicked out of power. The Italians then surrendered. However, the end of the war drew much nearer with D-Day, which took place the 6th of June. On the right, we see Dwight Eisenhower. He was the leader who commanded this invasion. This was the Allied invasion of Western France, the second front that Joseph Stalin had been begging for. The arrow here shows Normandy. It was on these beaches that Allied forces came together in order to invade and to kick the Germans out of France. It was defenses like these that they were going up against. This was truly an international invading force. The Americans led it and also included many soldiers, but it involved the British, the French, Canadians, Australians, and many others. It was also a technological success that had to be coordinated. It involved 500,000 troops, 11,000 aircrafts, and 4,000 vessels that had to come together, and they were successful on those beaches of Normandy. As the Allied troops moved closer to Germany, they brought the fighting home to civilians. The city of Dresden was a major cultural and historical center. It was also the site of a massive Allied bombing campaign early in 1945. Both the Americans and the British were involved with this. Over the course of this bombing raids, between 25,000 and probably 50,000 civilians were killed. They wanted to bring home the war so that the Germans would surrender unconditionally. Possibly the most important wartime conference between the Big Three took place shortly thereafter in February of 1945 at Yalta. Several key issues were discussed at the Yalta Conference as they tried to determine what should happen following Germany's defeat. First of all, they agreed that free elections would have to be held in Poland. Secondly, they confirmed that Germany would have to be occupied by the Allied powers after Germany's defeat. Third, the Soviets reaffirmed that it would join the war against the Japanese at least 3 months after Germany had been defeated. Lastly, the Allied powers agreed to create a new international organization called the United Nations. Only a few months after this Yalta Conference, Adolf Hitler committed suicide, along with his longtime mistress, Eva Braun. About a week later, Germany surrendered. On the right, we see the headline from the Ludington Daily News when it was learned that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Well, I'd like to wrap up some of the main points of the presentation next. This presentation addressed the nightmare of the Second World War. First, it focused on the causes of the war, and then key events in the European theater, with a particular focus on Germany's initial successes. And then the diplomacy between the Allied powers. What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to identify the key factors that led to Germany's defeat. Don't worry, next lecture, we will focus on the U.S. actions to defeat the Japanese in the Second World War. That's it for today. The focus was World War II, Part 1. Next lecture, World War II, Part 2, and the Cold War.